authors seen in this channel so far reflected the perspectives from the center of the system. However, on the periphery, there's a different reality from the concepts we have seen so far. Thus, international relations did not have a space for the periphery. At the beginning of the 20th century, we were unable to understand the dynamics of the colonial context. In the peripheral reality of the Cold War, we don't observe the ideas that marked the USA and the USSR. From the 19th onwards, we have an order marked by the hegemony of a model of political organization that seeks to become universal. In this, we can see a resentment in the periphery and the events there, because there is only one order. The instability of the periphery becomes a factor for the instability of the system. Thus, it is understood that to create order, stabilization mechanisms, it is necessary to understand how the periphery works. Therefore, we have theories that seek to understand the dynamics of actors on the periphery, such as peripheral realism and subaltern realism, for example. After that, it is worth emphasizing the difference between the reflection from the perspective of the periphery and the postcolonial reflection. Ayub and Escudet's discussions seek to understand the dynamics of the periphery within an international system of states. They observe a world in which political strategies are undertaken by states. In postcolonialism, we seek to characterize the idea that the state is a European response to a European problem. There's the idea that to understand the peripheral space, it is necessary to understand that the role of the state was something imposed. Thus, it is necessary to understand the cultural structures that were erased as a result of this imposition. In order to observe this, postcolonialism understands the state as a problem. Thus, in order to understand the power dynamics of a peripheral space, it is necessary to bear in mind the consequences of imposing the state in a different universe for which it was formulated. In this process of imposition and its consequences, we have the focus of postcolonialism, in which two important authors can be seen, Edward Said and Frantz Fanon. The theories of international relations were designed to deal with a particular order, as it was necessary to deal with the disruption of the European order and how to reorder this system. So the European system made sense in itself. The relationship between order and the space where it projected beyond Europe was not considered. The concepts of international relations that were born with Carr and Morgenthau are useful to understand, for example, the power relations between England and France. However, the projection of colonial power does not take place within these premises. Thus, we have little conceptual reflection on how the organization of power is reflected in international relations. In the Cold War, we observed the discussion of bipolarity and deterrence. Even in that context, if we analyze what happens on the periphery of the system, we have a diversity of forms of production of violence that exists. However, this plurality of forms of violence and of power architectures produced are absent in the reflection of the bipolarity in the international system. Thus, we have the idea that there is a set of concepts capable of explaining the relationship between the US and the USSR, but that does not address the different forms of violence that are beginning to materialize in Bolivia, Central America, and other places, for example. From this, it should be noted that the periphery is not homogeneous, but what is marked is the existence of different forms of violence, and the role of political structures are being ignored in the analysis of the international system. Order and its stability are anchored in the dynamics of power between the great forces of the system. Thus, its stability lies in the inability of direct conflict between the US and USSR. As violence in the periphery does not have a direct impact on order, it is not addressed. From the 19th onwards, we had the idea of hegemony of political and social organization, with an expectation of universalization of the model from the center to the periphery. This makes more visible the inability to adapt the dynamics of the periphery to the premises of how the political world works. When producing this clash between regulating the problem of politics and the different resistances from the transformations of the system's periphery, we have a problem that concerns the functioning of international relations. Thus, in the world of the 90s, where we have technology that allows a flow of people and information, the instability of the periphery can generate instability in the system as a whole. When analyzing international relations, it is observed that the dynamics of the periphery is particular, and, therefore, it is necessary to understand this aspect in order to achieve stability. From this, a demand is born on how to understand how the periphery works and to translate the specificities of its dynamics to the center. So we have two famous theories, Escude's Peripheral Realism and Ayoub's Subaltern Realism. In Peripheral Realism, Escude argues that the failure of international relations to understand the specificity of the periphery lies in the idea that the international system is anarchic. From the point of view of political practice in the periphery space, this does not help to make decisions and understand events. This can be understood in view of the power discrepancy between the peripheral countries and the powers of the system, in which the peripheral countries are subject to the strongest countries in the system. For Escude, there is an incipient hierarchy. It is a hierarchy in which the distribution of power is clearly established, and it is not possible to understand dynamics without understanding the distribution of power or the hierarchy of power. How this hierarchy translates into different roles for different actors is not governed by a regular chain of command, such as empires, districts, etc. What exists is a hierarchy with different roles in which the powers create the rules. Even in a system without a central government, powers create the norms and institutions that function in that system. Decision-making by peripheral countries is based on this dichotomy. The role of peripheral countries is based on this relationship between costs and benefits, between obeying the rules installed by force of the system or rebelling against them. This logic is not exact. It depends on the circumstances. As an example of a country that rebelled against the system, we have North Korea. By rebelling, the country was able to defend positions it could not before. Thus, from a cost-benefit perspective, it is worth taking the position of the system's pariah. Therefore, it is shown that in specific circumstances, it is beneficial to be a rebel because it creates visibility as opposed to assuming a role within international institutions that do not reflect their interests. Another important theory is Subaltern Realism, in which Ayoub argues about the difficulty of conventional theories in understanding the political experience of the periphery of the system. This failure of traditional theories can be understood considering that realism has the idea of a combination of anarchy, sovereignty, and balance of power, while the premise is that the fundamental threat comes from the outside to the inside. In order to understand the security condition of your state, it is necessary to understand its role in the balance of power because it is the capacity of the conjuncture of external forces to overcome its defense capabilities that we understand as the main source of threat. However, Ayoub argues that conventional theory fails to understand the reality of the peripheral world, where the greatest sources of instability to integrity are internal. This happens because of the process of formation of national states. The European national states are a product of a historical context characterized by the centralization of power that lasted centuries of war and brutality until it consolidated sovereignty. Therefore, the narratives that resisted the reaffirmation of the modern state, which gave a degree of strong institutional stability in Europe, were erased. 300 years were marked by extermination. In the peripheral scenario, countries that decolonized from the 60s onwards went through the process of centralization of power quickly compared to Europe. Thus, it is understood that they do not have enough time for an effective centralization of power, and the international normative structures do not allow this to happen in the same way as in Europe. Therefore, Ayoub emphasizes that the conditions for the formation of states are different. When we have a temporal compression, this centralization process is not as effective, in which there is a political fragmentation in the structural organizations around states, where the forces of instability are internal. If we don't understand this scenario, we don't understand the periphery. Given that centralization has not occurred, if we do not solve the problem of the internal threat, instability will continue to exist. From this, it is important to highlight the context of the international scenario in which Ayoub creates his arguments. In this scenario, we have a discourse about peripheral countries, about failed states, which have legal sovereignty, but their projection of power internally and organizing themselves as a state is fragile. There is an understanding of building a culturalist narrative to explain why these states act in this way, in which the blame lies in some aspect of their culture that makes their political organization unfeasible. Therefore, Ayub created an argument against this narrative, in which what justifies the state's fragility is the different circumstances in which it was subjected. One of the implications of the argument is that the international system and its impositions hinder the state. Thus, he critically poses the universalization of international institutions. Dependency theory is a forerunner of the theories of the 90s. It seeks to show that the political-economic logic through which the international system organizes the post-Second World War scenario makes sense to forces like the US. It wants this process of economic liberalization to integrate countries into capitalism and seeks to reorganize the liberal project to demonstrate that liberalism is not only good for the US, but also for other countries. The criticism of dependency theory is that this perspective on the dynamics of the periphery and the international system reflects the concerns of the center of the system and is incapable of understanding the particularity of the periphery. It is the same argument but centered on political economy analysis. The theory says that for the US, the idea of comparative advantage makes more sense. However, in the periphery, this will deteriorate the terms of trade. From the moment we specialize, products from the center are valued more than the process of valuing the periphery of the system. So if we change the import profile, what happens is that over time, the product chain will devalue. The three models mentioned reflect on how to think about the strategy of the peripheral state to understand the contradictions that emerge from the particularity of its dynamics. Periphery theories have a different project from that of postcolonialism. In postcolonialism, we have different theories and from different parts of the globe, but it has one aspect in common. They are committed to the idea of observing the state as a problem rather than thinking about the strategies of peripheral countries. For them, the important thing is to understand historically that the state is a novelty in that space. It is a European response to a set of European problems. It reflects the specifics of European politics and has the mechanisms for that structure. Therefore, postcolonialism looks at the state in its particularity. It is a specific response to a localized problem that has become transnationalized. From this, the impact of imposing a foreign form of organization on different cultures is analyzed, considering its consequences. In this scenario, it is worth highlighting Edward Said's contribution to the idea of Orientalism. From this, he seeks to show the arbitrariness of the notion of Orient in the European world, as it usually presents distinct and even contradictory connotations, recovering experiences from unconnected spaces on the globe. What is projected through the concept of East does not really speak about the East. It merely demonstrates what the West projects to reinforce an image of itself. The author seeks to demonstrate that the narrative about the Orient says fundamentally about what the West seeks to project when it reinforces the distinction between them. Furthermore, we have the contribution of Franz Fanon, who argues about the idea of the impact of symbolic experience on the experience of the colonized. The role of colonization is usually shown in the material aspect, with the number of deaths, for example. For the author, this disregards the perversity of the colonial experience. This experience is in the mind of the colonized. When colonization is imposed, we have a model of civilization that is also imposed. Therefore, there's the conditioning of ideals of civilization from other cultures to which the individual should aspire. This also implies the rejection of his own culture. The colonized lives denying their own identity in a process that lasts their entire lives. Thus, he seeks to show that symbolic violence is stronger than material violence.